On the evening of January 23, 1959, beneath the cold electric lights of Sverdlovsk's main railway station, a group of young Soviet hikers prepared to depart on what was expected to be a challenging yet controlled winter expedition into the northern Ural Mountains. The temperature had already dropped below -20 degrees Celsius, and the air carried the distinct metallic sharpness typical of deep continental winters, the kind that stiffens fabric, burns exposed skin within seconds, and turns every inhalation into a measured act. Nothing about the weather was unusual for that region, and certainly nothing suggested that this departure would later become the starting point of one of the most enduring mysteries of the 20th century. The expedition had not been assembled casually. Their route was officially reviewed and approved by the city's Route Qualification Commission and assigned Category 3 difficulty, the highest level available for ski expeditions at the time. Such classification demanded proven endurance, navigational competence, psychological stability, and prior experience in sub-zero survival. Participants were expected to function as a disciplined unit capable of making rational decisions even under extreme stress. The leader was Igor Alexeyevich Dyatlov, a 23-year-old radio engineering student in his 5th year at the Ural Polytechnic Institute. Among serious hikers, Dyatlov was already regarded as methodical and unusually composed. He favored structured planning, double-checked equipment, and believed strongly in group cohesion, qualities that made him a natural choice for leadership despite his young age. Those who knew him rarely described him as impulsive. The group consisted of 10 members whose backgrounds reflected both technical education and practical outdoor experience. Zinaida Kolmogorova, 22, possessed remarkable stamina and a temperament well suited to harsh environments. Ludmila Dubinina, only 20, had repeatedly demonstrated a level of physical resilience that surprised even older hikers. Rustem Slobodin, 23, trained as an engineer and was known for his persistence under fatigue. Yuri Doroshenko, 21, brought an easy optimism that helped stabilize group morale during difficult stretches. Georgy Krivonishenko, 23, worked at the secret nuclear installation Mayak, an indication of the trust placed in him by the state. Alexander Kolevatov, 24, was a physicist who had previously been employed at a classified research facility in Moscow. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, 23, strong and dependable, came from a family of French origin but was thoroughly integrated into Soviet academic life. The oldest member, Semyon Zolotaryov, age 38, stood apart not only because of his age, but also because he was a decorated war veteran and certified hiking instructor whose presence alone would normally reduce the likelihood of catastrophic error. Completing the group was Yuri Yudin, 21, an economics student whose role appeared no different from the others. He would later become known for a single reason. He was the only member who did not die on the mountain. Their destination was Mount Otorten, situated roughly 350 kilometers north of Sverdlovsk. The region was remote even by Soviet standards, a landscape of frozen rivers, dense taiga, and exposed alpine slopes where winter storms could form with little warning. In the language of the indigenous Mansi people, the mountain's name is often translated as "do not go there." Whether intended as a literal warning or simply a reflection of difficult terrain was unclear, but among ambitious post-war hikers, forbidding names tended to attract rather than deter. On January 24th, the group arrived in the northern settlement of Ivdol, an industrial town closely associated at the time with the vast network of corrective labor camps that dotted the region. Beyond Ivdol, infrastructure thinned rapidly. Roads narrowed, communication lines became sparse, and the psychological boundary between civilization and wilderness grew increasingly apparent. The following day, January 25th, they continued by cargo truck to the small settlement of Vizhay, widely regarded as the final inhabited outpost before the landscape surrendered entirely to forest and mountain. By January 26th, the hikers reached a logging site known as the 41st Quarter and spent the night in a wooden workers' barracks. Lumber workers who later spoke with investigators consistently described the group as organized, confident, and properly equipped, Exactly the impression a competent winter expedition should project before entering hazardous territory. Their gear reflected experience rather than enthusiasm. Padded military jackets for insulation, layered wool garments for thermal regulation, reinforced storm coats, fur-lined hats, multiple glove systems, felt boots designed to preserve warmth even when compressed by bindings, ice axes, durable skis, film cameras for documentation, a portable expedition stove, and food supplies carefully calculated to sustain them for approximately 2 weeks in freezing conditions. Temperatures during this period hovered between -25 and -30 degrees Celsius, severe enough to kill the unprepared yet considered manageable by seasoned Ural hikers. The expedition officially began on January 27th. Before departure, Dyatlov sent a telegram back to the Institute stating that the group expected to return around February 12th and that any alarm should wait until at least February 15th. It was a routine administrative gesture, one repeated by countless expedition leaders, yet it would later define the timeline of the search effort. The first stage of their journey followed the frozen Lazva River. Snow lay deep across the valley floor, sometimes approaching a meter, forcing the hikers to expend significant energy with each forward step. Progress slowed to roughly 1.5 kilometers per hour, but there was nothing abnormal about this pace given the conditions. Diaries later recovered from the site would describe an atmosphere that remained notably positive. Jokes exchanged during rest stops, songs carried quietly into the cold evening air, and a sense of controlled purpose that suggested confidence rather than strain. No entries hinted at anxiety. No disagreements were recorded. On January 28th, however, the first fracture in the expedition occurred, subtle at the time, but decisive in retrospect. Yuri Yudin began suffering acute pain in his leg as a chronic sciatic condition abruptly worsened. Each kilometer became progressively more difficult, and the group quickly recognized the practical implications. A mobility-compromised member could slow evacuation if weather deteriorated and would increase risk for everyone. After a brief discussion, the decision was made for Yudin to turn back. He redistributed portions of his equipment among the others, embraced his companions, and watched as they continued deeper into the white distance before beginning his solitary return. Years later, when recalling that moment, he would speak without dramatics, yet with unmistakable weight, stating simply that he never imagined he was seeing them for the final time. In that quiet separation lay an accident of fate. His illness saved his life. By January 29th, the hikers had penetrated fully into the northern taiga. Dense forest gradually yielded to harsher terrain, trees thinning as elevation increased and winds sweeping more freely across open ground. The environment was transitioning toward mountain tundra, broad, exposed slopes devoid of natural windbreaks, where storms could erase tracks within minutes. Navigation required constant attention. On January 31st, the group reached the base of a mountain called Kolit Sayakal. In the Mansi language, the name translates to Mountain of the Dead, a title that existed long before 1959 and likely referred to the area's poor hunting rather than any recorded catastrophe. Yet geography sometimes acquires meaning only after events impose it. At the mountain's base, the hikers constructed a cache, burying part of their food and equipment beneath the snow to reduce load weight for the ascent. The decision reflected disciplined planning. Caches were standard practice in demanding routes and indicated that the group anticipated returning along the same path. Everything pointed to a controlled expedition proceeding according to expectation. On February 1st, 1959, they began the climb toward the pass under rapidly deteriorating weather. A powerful crosswind drove snow across the slope, gradually producing the disorienting effect mountaineers describe as a whiteout, a visual condition in which sky and ground merge into a single depthless field, destroying contrast and making spatial judgment unreliable. Investigators would later estimate that during this phase the group drifted approximately 1.5 kilometers off their intended route before emerging onto an exposed incline of Kolit Sayakal. Whether this deviation resulted from navigational error or deliberate strategy would remain debated for decades, though many experts believe Dyatlov chose not to descend into the forest, which would have meant surrendering hard-earned elevation, and instead opted to establish camp directly on the slope with the intention of continuing at first light. At approximately 5 in the evening, they began preparing their camp, cutting a platform into the hardened snow using skis and shovels before erecting a large canvas tent designed to accommodate all members. They partially embedded the structure into the slope to reduce wind exposure, a technique consistent with advanced winter practice. Backpacks were arranged along the interior walls, leaving a narrow passage through the center. The expedition stove remained disassembled, suggesting they anticipated no immediate threat and likely planned only a simple meal before sleep. Their final photographs were taken in fading daylight, indistinct figures leaning into the wind, snow streaming laterally across the frame. One image captured a member carving into the drift to stabilize the tent. It would become the last photograph the group ever made. That night, temperatures likely fell below -30 degrees Celsius, while wind speeds across the exposed mountainside may have exceeded 20 meters per second. Severe conditions, certainly, but not beyond the tolerance of hikers with their level of training. Nothing in the recovered diaries indicated alarm, conflict, or distress. By every measurable sign, 9 experienced individuals settled into their shelter expecting an ordinary, if uncomfortable, winter night. Sometime between the late hours of February 1st and the early darkness of February 2nd, something occurred that fundamentally overrode training, logic, and survival instinct. For reasons that remain contested, the hikers abruptly abandoned the tent. They did not fully dress. They did not secure proper footwear. They did not assemble the stove or gather essential equipment. Instead, they cut their way out through the canvas from the inside and moved into the violent alpine night, a decision so extreme that investigators would spend generations attempting to understand what force or perception could have made the frozen darkness outside appear safer than the shelter they had just constructed. None of them would survive the consequences of that choice, and by morning the silent slope of Kholat Syakhl held the first fragile traces of a mystery that would resist definitive explanation for decades. When February 12, 1959 passed without a telegram from the expedition, no immediate alarm followed. Delays were common in winter travel, and experienced groups often returned several days behind schedule after being slowed by weather or terrain. Inside the Ural Polytechnic Institute, administrators initially treated the silence as routine. Yet among relatives and fellow students, a quieter unease began forming. Those who knew Igor Dyatlov understood him as disciplined to the point of rigidity, failing to send word, if circumstances allowed, would have been deeply out of character. By February 15th, concern had grown impossible to dismiss. Still, official response moved cautiously. Soviet expedition culture assumed self-reliance, and premature rescue operations across remote wilderness demanded enormous resources. Only after continued absence did the Institute authorize the first search effort. Volunteers, students, and experienced hikers assembled quickly, driven by a mixture of loyalty and the unspoken awareness that winter survival windows were brutally narrow. In sub-zero mountain environments, a disabled group without adequate shelter could perish in hours rather than days. On February 19th, organized search parties began moving north toward the last known segment of the route. Soon afterward, the operation expanded beyond civilian volunteers. Aircraft were assigned to scan the immense white terrain from above, their crews instructed to watch for unnatural shapes, ski tracks, fabric, smoke, anything that interrupted the monotony of snow. Military personnel joined the effort, bringing logistical structure but also underscoring the seriousness of the situation. Entire sectors of the northern Urals were methodically combed despite punishing wind and temperatures that continued to plunge well below zero. Days passed with nothing but untouched wilderness. Then, on February 26, 1959, a search group ascending the eastern shoulder of Kholat Syakhl noticed a dark, angular form interrupting the slope. At a distance, it appeared almost geological, like an exposed patch of rock breaking through the snowpack. As the rescuers drew closer, the outline sharpened into something unmistakably artificial. It was the tent. Even before reaching it, several details felt wrong. The structure leaned unevenly, partially collapsed under accumulated snow, its fabric stiffened by ice. No footprints circled it. No movement disturbed the drifted surface. The mountain was silent except for the steady force of the wind, dragging fine crystals across the incline. Rescuers approached cautiously, calling out though logic told them no one would answer. The first shock came quickly. The tent was damaged. Long slashes ran across the canvas. When investigators later examined the fabric, they would confirm what the rescuers already suspected from the direction of the cuts. The openings had been made from the inside. Experienced hikers do not destroy their own shelter unless confronted with something they perceive as immediately life-threatening. The normal exit remained accessible, yet whoever fled had chosen speed over order. Inside, the scene resembled a paused moment rather than an abandoned camp. Boots stood where they had been removed. Heavy outer garments lay folded or draped across bedding. Personal belongings, cameras, notebooks, money, identification papers, remained untouched. Food was still packed. Nothing suggested preparation for departure. Instead, everything implied interruption. If the group had intended to relocate camp, they would have dressed first. If attackers had approached, signs of struggle would likely have been visible. Yet the interior carried neither the chaos of a fight nor the structure of a planned withdrawal. It felt as though 9 individuals had risen almost simultaneously and left within seconds. Outside the tent, the rescuers found the next crucial piece of evidence: a line of footprints descending the slope toward the distant tree line. Wind had hardened the surface enough to preserve them faintly, though not indefinitely. Investigators would later count impressions belonging to roughly 8 or 9 people moving in the same direction. What struck observers immediately was not panic but relative order. The stride patterns indicated walking rather than uncontrolled flight. Even more disturbing was what many of those prints lacked. Several were made by bare feet, others by feet wrapped only in socks. A few showed the outline of a single felt boot. In temperatures approaching -30 degrees Celsius, exposed skin could freeze within minutes. Yet the tracks suggested the group had continued downhill for over a kilometer toward the forest boundary. The question formed instantly and refused to fade. What could frighten trained hikers enough to abandon boots and insulation, the difference between life and death, while still retaining the composure to move in formation? Following the trail required effort. Wind had already begun erasing sections. As the searchers descended, the open slope gradually yielded to scattered trees marking the edge of the taiga. There, near a large Siberian cedar, they discovered signs that the hikers had attempted to survive after leaving the tent. Beneath the tree lay the remains of a small fire, charred branches, blackened fragments of wood, and ash partially buried by fresh snow. Nearby were the first bodies. Yuri Doroshenko and Georgy Krivonichenko lay close to one another, dressed in little more than undergarments. Their skin displayed the darkened discoloration associated with advanced hypothermia. Yet another detail drew immediate attention. Their hands were badly damaged. Knuckles were torn. Fingernails were broken. The injuries suggested frantic physical effort shortly before death. When rescuers looked upward, the explanation presented itself. Several branches of the cedar were snapped at heights reaching roughly 5 meters. Bark had been stripped away in places, as though someone had climbed the trunk in desperation, possibly to gain visibility above the lower branches, perhaps searching for the tent's faint outline against the mountain or scanning for whatever threat had driven them from it. The fire indicated cognition and cooperation. At least some members had retained enough clarity to gather wood and attempt warmth. But the blaze had been too small, the clothing insufficient, and the cold absolute. Continuing along the invisible line between forest and slope, Searchers soon located another body, Igor Dyatlov himself. He lay face down in the snow, arms extended ahead, positioned as if crawling. The orientation of his body was unmistakable. He had been moving back toward the tent. It was a decision investigators would later interpret as rational. The tent contained clothing, equipment, and the only meaningful shelter within reach. Reaching it could have reversed their odds. Several hundred meters farther upslope, they found Zinaida Kolmogorova. Her posture echoed the same narrative, collapsed during attempted return. There were indications she had pushed forward through deepening exhaustion until her body simply failed. Soon after, Rustam Slobodin was discovered. Unlike the others, he showed evidence of a head injury later identified as a skull fracture. Whether the trauma occurred before his retreat or during it remained uncertain, but the fact that he continued moving suggested he had not died immediately from a blow. The preliminary conclusion for these three was consistent. Hypothermia. Alone, inadequately dressed, and exposed to relentless wind, even the strongest physiology eventually yields. By early March, 5 bodies had been recovered. The 2 beneath the cedar and the 3 scattered along the slope between forest and tent. For members of the expedition, however, remained missing. Search efforts intensified despite worsening fatigue among rescuers. The landscape offered few clues, and each snowfall threatened to bury evidence permanently. Yet what investigators could already reconstruct formed a pattern both logical and deeply unsettling. The group had left the tent together, reached the forest, attempted to create heat, and then, for reasons not yet understood, some had tried to return while others stayed behind. Still unanswered was the question underlying every observation. What initial event had forced them into the night? The answer did not lie inside the tent alone, nor beside the cedar. It remained hidden somewhere beneath the accumulating snow. When the remaining 4 hikers were finally discovered months later, the nature of the case would shift dramatically, from a tragedy explainable by exposure to something far more complex. Because the injuries awaiting investigators were not consistent with cold, they suggested overwhelming force, internal damage without corresponding external wounds, and circumstances that even seasoned forensic specialists struggled to interpret. The mountain, it seemed, was not finished revealing its story, and the deeper rescuers searched, the less certain that story became. By the beginning of March 1959, investigators believed they were beginning to understand the general outline of the tragedy. 5 bodies had been recovered, all positioned between the cedar tree and the abandoned tent, and the working assumption leaned toward a scenario involving sudden exposure, failed attempts at survival, and fatal hypothermia. The mountain appeared harsh but explainable. Yet 4 members of the expedition were still missing. Until they were found, no reconstruction could be considered complete. Search operations continued across the slope and into the surrounding forest, but the task grew more difficult with each passing week. Snowstorms repeatedly swept across Kolit-Syakhl, redistributing massive drifts that concealed depressions, filled tracks, and erased subtle variations in terrain. Probing rods were used systematically as rescuers advanced in measured lines, thrusting metal poles into the snowpack in hopes of striking fabric or frozen ground irregularities. Temperatures remained brutally low, and even trained personnel found their endurance tested by the monotony of white horizons and the psychological strain of searching a landscape that seemed determined to keep its secrets. March yielded nothing, nor did April. It was not until May 4th, 1959, more than 3 months after the night the hikers fled their tent, that the mountain surrendered the next piece of evidence. A searcher probing a section of forest roughly 70 meters beyond the cedar felt his pole suddenly drop farther than expected. The snow there had formed a deceptive bridge over a narrow ravine, a natural drainage channel partially hidden beneath accumulated winter layers that in some places exceeded 4 meters deep. Excavation began immediately. As rescuers cut downward through compacted snow, fragments of clothing appeared first, dark shapes against the white, followed by something far more disturbing. One by one, the remaining 4 hikers emerged from the frozen hollow. They were not arranged randomly. The bodies of Lyudmila Dubinina, Semyon Zolotaryov, Alexander Kolevatov, and Nikolai Thibault-Brignol lay clustered together as though they had attempted to establish a more permanent refuge than the exposed ground near the cedar. Branches and remnants of clothing suggested the construction of a crude snow den, a last effort to create insulation against lethal wind. Unlike the earlier victims, several of these hikers wore additional garments, some later identified as belonging to Doroshenko and Krivonishenko. The implication was immediate and grim. After the first 2 men died, the survivors had removed usable clothing in a rational attempt to preserve heat. It was a decision consistent with survival behavior rather than panic. It was not their positioning that stunned investigators. It was their injuries. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol had suffered massive skull trauma. The fracture was extensive, comparable, according to the examining pathologist, to the force typically seen in high-speed vehicle collisions. However, the skin covering the wound showed minimal external damage. There were no deep lacerations, no patterns suggesting a weapon, and no surrounding evidence of struggle. Alexander Kolevatov displayed fewer dramatic injuries, but showed signs of severe cold stress and physical exhaustion, indicating he had likely endured prolonged exposure before death. Semyon Zolotaryov presented one of the most perplexing cases. Multiple ribs on the right side of his chest were broken with such force that the structure of the thoracic cage had been significantly compromised. Again, external wounds were surprisingly limited. The damage appeared to have originated from an immense compressive pressure rather than sharp trauma. Then investigators reached Lyudmila Dubinina. Her injuries were the most severe of all. Several ribs were fractured bilaterally, creating what medical examiners described as a floating chest, a condition associated with overwhelming mechanical force. Internal hemorrhaging confirmed the injuries had occurred while she was still alive. Yet the most shocking detail emerged during autopsy. Her tongue was missing, along with soft tissues of the mouth. Portions of her lips and facial structures were also absent. Early whispers speculated about mutilation. Forensic analysis would later propose a more natural explanation: post-mortem tissue loss caused by decomposition in a moist environment combined with scavenging activity from small animals. The ravine, unlike the exposed slope, functioned as a cold trap that periodically collected meltwater beneath the snow. Still, the visual impact on those who first examined the remains was profound. There was another detail investigators could not ignore. Some articles of clothing recovered from these 4 hikers registered elevated levels of radiation when tested with a Geiger counter. The readings were not catastrophic, but they exceeded typical background expectations. This discovery generated immediate speculation, particularly given that Krivonishenko had worked within the Soviet nuclear industry. Whether the contamination originated from his professional environment or from another source would never be conclusively demonstrated. As forensic reports accumulated, the simplicity of the original hypothermia theory began to erode. While cold remained a contributing factor, the magnitude of certain injuries demanded an explanation involving tremendous force. Yet the surrounding environment showed no obvious mechanism. No avalanche debris had buried the ravine. No fallen trees indicated crushing impact. There were no footprints from strangers, no shell casings, no blade wounds, no evidence of interpersonal violence. The paradox deepened. How could bodies exhibit trauma comparable to catastrophic accidents while the landscape around them remained largely undisturbed? Medical examiners ultimately concluded that 3 of the 4, Dubinina, Zolotaryov, and Thibault-Brignol, died from fatal traumatic injuries, with hypothermia acting as a secondary factor in at least some cases. Kolevatov's death was attributed primarily to exposure. Investigators now faced a radically altered case. What initially resembled a tragic but comprehensible survival failure had transformed into something far more complex. A chain of events involving powerful physical forces fragmented group movement, and decisions that alternated between rational strategy and inexplicable urgency. Attention returned inevitably to the tent. Whatever had driven the hikers onto the slope must have been sufficiently terrifying to override their training. Yet the later behavior of the group, building fires, redistributing clothing, attempting shelter, demonstrated that their capacity for reason had not vanished entirely. This was not the pattern of irrational hysteria, it was the pattern of people reacting to a threat they believed was immediate. Speculation began to circulate quietly among search personnel. Some wondered about a slab avalanche, a dense sheet of compacted snow capable of breaking loose without leaving the dramatic debris associated with larger slides. Others mentioned the possibility of powerful katabatic winds, sudden gravity-driven airflows known to surge down mountain slopes with explosive force. A few privately entertained darker ideas involving military testing in remote regions where secrecy was routine. Officially, however, conclusions remained restrained. The mountain offered fragments, not clarity. When the final body was transported from the ravine and the recovery phase ended, the investigation entered a new stage, one that would attempt to transform scattered physical evidence into a coherent narrative. Instead, it would produce one of the most controversial closing statements in Soviet forensic history, attributing the deaths to a compelling natural force, a phrase precise enough to sound authoritative yet vague enough to answer almost nothing. Long after the search teams departed and the last tracks faded beneath fresh snow, Kholat's cycle returned to silence. But the questions did not. They multiplied. When the final bodies were recovered in early May 1959, the search phase officially transitioned into a full forensic investigation. What had begun as a rescue effort was now unmistakably a legal inquiry into the unexplained deaths of 9 experienced hikers. Responsibility fell to prosecutor Lev Ivanov, a methodical investigator accustomed to working within the structured expectations of the Soviet judicial system, where conclusions were typically clear and ambiguity was rarely tolerated in official records. From the outset, Ivanov faced a problem that would persist throughout the case. Every piece of evidence seemed to answer one question while simultaneously creating 2 more. The tent became the logical starting point. Forensic specialists carefully documented the slashes in the canvas and confirmed what rescuers had already suspected. The fabric had been cut from the inside. The positioning of the tears suggested urgency rather than method. Whoever wielded the knife had not attempted to preserve the structure. The goal had been immediate exit. Inside the tent, the arrangement of belongings reinforced the same conclusion. Boots remained lined along the floor. Heavy coats and insulated trousers were still accessible. Blankets and personal items were undisturbed. There were no signs of prolonged internal struggle, no bloodstains, and no indication that an external force had penetrated the shelter. Investigators attempted to reconstruct the moment of departure. The most widely accepted interpretation was that the group had been partially undressed, likely preparing for sleep, when something compelled them to leave without delay. The question was what circumstance could produce such unanimous behavior among trained individuals who understood better than most that exposure to alpine winter conditions without proper clothing was almost certainly fatal. Attention next turned toward the footprints leading away from the tent. Photographs and measurements were taken before wind could degrade the impressions further. Analysts noted again that the tracks indicated controlled movement rather than chaotic flight. Stride length appeared consistent with walking speed. There are no deep heel marks suggesting sprinting, nor overlapping patterns that would indicate trampling panic. This detail complicated every aggressive scenario investigators attempted to construct. If the hikers were escaping immediate physical danger, attackers, for instance, instinct would normally drive them to run. Yet they had walked. One proposed explanation involved avalanche activity. Even a relatively small slab avalanche can generate a low, concussive sound capable of triggering fear, particularly at night. If the group believed a larger collapse was imminent, abandoning the tent quickly might have seemed rational. However, when avalanche specialists later examined the slope, several contradictions emerged. The incline measured roughly 20 degrees, below the angle typically required for large-scale slab release. More importantly, the tent had not been buried. Its supporting ski poles remained upright, and the surrounding snowpack showed no clear displacement pattern. Still, investigators hesitated to dismiss the theory entirely snow behavior can be unpredictable, and smaller slides sometimes leave minimal trace. Another line of inquiry explored the possibility of violent human involvement. The late 1950s were marked by intense geopolitical tension, and remote regions of the Soviet Union occasionally hosted classified military activity. Rumors surfaced suggesting the hikers might have encountered personnel connected to weapons testing or secret exercises. Yet the physical evidence resisted that narrative. No foreign footprints were documented near the site. No cercasings. No blade wounds consistent with combat. None of the victims displayed defensive injuries typical of interpersonal violence. Moreover, valuable items, money, cameras, remained untouched, eliminating robbery as a plausible motive. The injuries discovered in the ravine complicated matters further. Medical examiner Boris Vozrozdeny, an experienced forensic pathologist, described the chest fractures suffered by Lyudmila Dubinina and Semyon Zolotaryov as comparable to trauma produced by a powerful car crash. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol's skull fracture suggested similarly extreme force. Yet the absence of corresponding external damage implied compression rather than penetration, as though the bodies had been subjected to immense pressure distributed across a broad surface. Investigators searched the ravine for environmental mechanisms capable of generating such force. One hypothesis suggested a fall into the concealed gully, perhaps onto uneven ice beneath the snow. Another proposed that a heavy snow overhang had collapsed onto them. Both ideas held partial credibility but lacked definitive supporting evidence. Radiation findings added another layer of uncertainty. Laboratory analysis detected elevated radioactive traces on several garments, particularly those associated with Krivonischenko and Dubinina. The levels were not immediately lethal, yet they exceeded normal environmental background. Officials quietly verified that Krivonischenko's employment at the Mayak nuclear facility could have exposed his clothing to contamination prior to the expedition. Still, the presence of radiation in a remote mountain tragedy proved difficult to contextualize and fueled speculation both inside and outside investigative circles. Then came the reports of unusual lights. Multiple witnesses from settlements hundreds of kilometers away, including hikers and even some military personnel, described observing glowing orange spheres moving silently across the winter sky during late January and early February of that year. Some accounts aligned temporally with the night of the incident. Investigators recorded these statements but struggled to connect them concretely to the deaths. Atmospheric phenomena, distant rocket tests, and experimental flares were all considered possible explanations, though documentation remained limited. Prosecutor Ivanov found himself navigating a landscape of possibilities without convergence. Each theory explained fragments but failed to unify the event sequence from tent departure to final fatalities. Even hikers' behavior resisted simple categorization. After leaving the tent, they had demonstrated cooperation, building a fire, redistributing clothing, attempting to construct shelter. These were not the actions of a group paralyzed by irrational terror. Something had frightened them, certainly, but not to the extent of destroying their capacity for organized survival. As weeks passed, subtle institutional pressure began to surface. The Soviet system favored closure. Unresolved cases implied disorder, and disorder reflected poorly on administrative competence. Yet no investigator could fabricate a mechanism that matched the evidence without inviting further contradiction. Eventually, the official conclusion adopted language that was both authoritative and evasive. The hikers, it declared, had perished as the result of a spontaneous, compelling natural force. The phrase entered the record with deliberate neutrality, specific enough to finalize the case, vague enough to avoid scrutiny. Shortly thereafter, the investigation was closed, and access to many documents became restricted. For years, the files would remain largely inaccessible to the public. But closure on paper does not erase uncertainty. Among the investigators themselves, the case left a lingering impression that something essential had been missed, not necessarily concealed, but never fully understood. Lev Ivanov would later speak in interviews about aspects of the event that continued to trouble him, particularly the unexplained lights and the magnitude of certain injuries. Meanwhile, the mountain returned to stillness. Snow buried the last physical disturbances, smoothing the slope until no casual observer could have guessed what had unfolded there only months before. Yet beyond the Urals, curiosity did not fade. Stories circulated quietly at first, then more openly as decades passed and restrictions loosened. The Dyatlov Pass incident began its transformation from closed investigation into enduring historical enigma, a case suspended somewhere between documented tragedy and unresolved phenomenon. And as researchers revisited the evidence year after year, one realization became increasingly difficult to avoid. Whatever forced 9 disciplined hikers from their shelter that night had never been identified. The official report ended the investigation. It did not end the mystery. When the official investigation into the deaths of the Dyatlov group approached its conclusion in the late spring of 1959, the expectation within the Soviet legal structure was not merely to document events, but to define them with clarity. Ambiguous endings were institutionally uncomfortable, unresolved causes implied gaps in control, and control was a principle the state preferred to project without fracture. Yet as prosecutor Lev Ivanov reviewed the accumulated forensic reports, witness statements, environmental analyses, and medical findings, it became increasingly evident that the case resisted simplification. The evidence formed a mosaic whose pieces aligned only partially. The tent had been cut from within. The hikers had exited underdressed into lethal temperatures. Footprints suggested controlled movement rather than chaotic flight. Some victims died of hypothermia after sustained effort to survive. Others suffered traumatic injuries comparable to those seen in severe industrial accidents. No signs of interpersonal violence were confirmed. No definitive avalanche debris had been identified. Radiation traces existed, but lacked context strong enough to define causation. Reports of luminous aerial phenomena remained anecdotal. Every pathway toward certainty narrowed into speculation before reaching conclusion. Ivanov faced a decision familiar to investigators confronting irreducible complexity. Whether to prolong inquiry in search of a definitive mechanism that might never emerge, or to formalize the most defensible explanation available. Ultimately, the official statement declared that the hikers had perished due to a spontaneous, compelling natural force. The phrasing was deliberate. It acknowledged environmental causation while avoiding commitment to any single phenomenon: avalanche, wind event, structural snow collapse, or another yet unidentified trigger. With that sentence, the case was administratively closed. Soon afterward, significant portions of the investigative archive were restricted from public access. In the context of the late 1950s, such classification was not extraordinary. Remote regions often overlapped with military logistics, geological surveys, or experimental programs whose details were not routinely disclosed. Still, the sealing of documents contributed to a perception, whether justified or not, that the mountain held information beyond what had been formally stated. For years, discussion of the incident circulated quietly among hiking communities rather than in mainstream channels. Within those circles, the tragedy assumed an almost instructional role, cited as a reminder that experience does not eliminate vulnerability and that environmental escalation can outpace even disciplined response. Routes across the northern Urals were not permanently abandoned, but awareness sharpened. Equipment standards evolved. Greater emphasis was placed on slope assessment and emergency layering. The deaths, though unexplained in mechanism, influenced survival culture indirectly. Lev Ivanov himself would later reflect on the investigation with measured candor. Decades after the files were closed, he acknowledged lingering uncertainty, particularly regarding the unexplained lights reported in the winter sky during that period. He stopped short of endorsing extraordinary interpretations, yet his recollections conveyed a professional discomfort, the sense of a puzzle whose final piece had never been located. As time advanced into the 1960s and 70s, the Soviet Union changed, but the Dyatlov case remained largely dormant within official memory. The mountain reclaimed its visual anonymity, snow cycles erased the last physical disruptions, and seasonal thaw carried smaller evidence downslope into streams that would never be searched. For casual travelers, Kholat Syakhl became simply another remote elevation in a vast range. Yet mysteries possess a peculiar endurance. They persist not only because questions remain unanswered, but because each generation revisits them with new tools and perspectives. By the late 20th century, as archival restrictions loosened and public appetite for historical inquiry expanded, the Dyatlov Pass incident began transitioning from closed case to enduring enigma. Researchers re-examined photographs with improved imaging techniques, recalculated weather patterns using modern climatology, and applied advances in trauma analysis unavailable to the original investigators. One emerging line of study focused on snow science. Computer simulations suggested that under certain wind conditions, cohesive slabs could accumulate gradually on slopes previously considered too shallow for classical avalanches. A delayed release, smaller than catastrophic slides, yet powerful enough to damage a tent, might reconcile several contradictions. The urgency of evacuation without large debris, the structured footprints, and the absence of burial. Such models did not prove the event occurred, but they demonstrated plausibility within known physics. Another area of interest involved aerodynamic behavior over mountain ridges. Researchers examining katabatic flows, gravity-driven winds descending from higher elevations, documented scenarios in which sudden gusts could exceed hurricane force, producing noise, pressure shifts, and structural strain. Combined with darkness, such conditions might create the perception of imminent collapse, even if the tent itself remained partially intact. Still, no single explanation achieved universal acceptance. Psychophysiology offered additional insight. Extreme cold accelerates cognitive decline, particularly when paired with sleep disruption and stress hormones. Decision pathways narrow risk assessment alters subtly but decisively. Actions that appear irrational in retrospect may have felt urgently logical in the moment. Seen through this lens, the hiker's behavior, rapid exit, regrouping at the forest, redistribution of clothing, attempts to construct shelter, reflects not chaos but adaptive reasoning within shrinking margins of survival. And yet the traumatic injuries in the ravine continued to resist easy integration into environmental narratives. Whether caused by falls, snow compression, or another mechanical force, they remained the case's most stubborn anomaly. Perhaps the most enduring lesson lies not in identifying a singular cause, but in recognizing convergence. Catastrophes in extreme landscapes rarely originate from one factor alone. More often, they emerge when multiple pressures intersect: unstable snow, violent wind, navigational uncertainty, darkness, fatigue, and the irreversible mathematics of heat loss. Each element alone may be survivable together. They can overwhelm even the prepared. By the early 21st century, renewed governmental review revisited the incident with contemporary methodology. Officials emphasized natural explanations, leaning toward avalanche-related dynamics while acknowledging environmental complexity. For many observers, the reassessment provided a measure of closure. For others, it merely refined the boundaries of uncertainty. Today, the name Dyatlov Pass carries a resonance that extends beyond geography. It represents a threshold where human competence encountered forces indifferent to intention. The hikers were neither reckless nor naive. They were skilled, educated, and accustomed to hardship. Their failure was not one of character, but of circumstance, a reminder that nature's scale can dwarf preparation. Stand on that slope now, and the scene offers little drama. Wind sweeps across unbroken snowfields. The horizon stretches clean and austere beneath a pale sky. Nothing in the landscape announces what occurred there decades ago. Yet absence itself can be instructive. Mountains do not archive memory in ways easily read. They erase more efficiently than they reveal. The official report ended with bureaucratic finality. History, however, rarely accepts such endings without reflection. Each retelling reconstructs the night anew, guided by evidence, yet shadowed by what evidence cannot fully illuminate. The investigation closed. The mystery endured, reconstructing the precise sequence of events that unfolded during the night between February 1st and February 2nd. 1959 has challenged investigators, scientists, and historians for decades. No survivors remain to provide testimony. No functioning recording devices capture the moment, and the mountain itself preserved only fragments, footprints, torn fabric, frozen bodies, and scattered behavioral clues. Yet by carefully analyzing physical evidence, weather data, terrain structure, and known human responses to extreme stress, experts have attempted to rebuild the final hours of the Dyatlov group with disciplined caution. The evening had likely begun without crisis. After establishing their tent on the exposed slope of Kolit, the hikers would have followed familiar routines. Snow had been cut into a platform, equipment arranged methodically, and insulation layered beneath their bedding. Such procedures were ingrained habits for experienced winter travelers. Repetition reduces error when temperatures punish hesitation. There is little indication that morale had collapsed. On the contrary, the absence of disordered belongings suggests a controlled environment consistent with preparation for rest. Weather conditions, however, were deteriorating. Archival meteorological reconstructions indicate that wind speeds may have risen dramatically after nightfall, funneling across the barren incline with little resistance. In open mountain tundra, wind does more than chill. It generates sound frequencies capable of altering perception. Later research would explore the possibility of infrasound, low-frequency vibrations produced when wind interacts with specific topographic shapes. Though inaudible in the conventional sense, such waves have been associated in laboratory settings with unease, anxiety, and sudden panic responses in humans. Whether such a phenomenon occurred that night remains unproven, yet it illustrates the type of invisible environmental stress capable of influencing judgment without leaving physical trace. Another hypothesis centers on snowpack instability. Even slopes below the classic avalanche angle can accumulate wind-driven slabs, dense layers resting atop weaker crystalline structures. If a portion of that slab shifted or cracked nearby, the resulting pressure wave could have transmitted through the snow with a deep, percussive force. Inside a tent, half asleep, hikers might interpret the vibration as the prelude to a larger collapse. Crucially, one need not be buried by an avalanche to fear one. The belief that tons of snow are about to descend can trigger immediate evacuation. Evidence suggests the group reacted collectively rather than individually. The cuts in the tent were positioned to create rapid openings, implying coordination rather than chaotic tearing. It is plausible that Dyatlov himself ordered the evacuation. Leadership under perceived avalanche threat typically prioritizes speed over equipment retrieval. Seconds matter when burial is possible. If so, the hikers may have intended to step only a short distance downslope, reassess conditions, and return once the danger passed. But something disrupted that intention. The descent toward the forest appears controlled in its early phase. Footprints lack the deep thrust typical of running. This detail has puzzled analysts, yet it aligns with a scenario in which the group believed the immediate hazard remained behind them rather than pursuing them. Walking conserves energy and reduces sweat, an important consideration in extreme cold. As they moved farther from the tent, however, a critical realization must have emerged. Returning quickly would not be simple. Darkness, wind, and blowing snow erase landmarks with astonishing speed. Without a visible reference point, even experienced navigators can lose orientation on uniform slopes. Reaching the tree line offered the first structural shelter. Forest density breaks wind and provides material for fire. Under the large cedar where the first bodies were later found, the hikers appear to have attempted exactly that. Broken branches high above the ground indicate that at least one member climbed the trunk, possibly to locate the tent or scan for movement across the mountainside. Skin embedded beneath fingernails supports the conclusion that the climb was desperate rather than exploratory. The fire they built was small but purposeful. Ignition in such cold requires dexterity already compromised by numbing fingers, suggesting they had not yet lost full motor control. Flames mean hope, but only briefly. Without sufficient fuel, heat dissipates faster than it accumulates. At some point, group strategy seems to have divided. Clothing recovered from the ravine victims indicates redistribution after Doroshenko and Krivonishenko succumbed to exposure. Removing garments from the deceased is a psychologically difficult act, yet entirely rational within survival logic. It demonstrates that cognitive function remained intact among those still alive. Why, then, did some attempt the return to the tent, while others moved deeper into the forest? One explanation proposes task allocation. Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin may have judged that reaching the tent, with its boots, insulated layers, and stove, offered the only sustainable path to survival. Meanwhile, the remaining members could have focused on improving shelter near the trees. The ravine where the last four were discovered provides a clue. Depressions naturally accumulate snow, forming pockets that block wind more effectively than open ground. Constructing a snow den, there would have been a logical escalation once it became clear the fire alone was insufficient. Yet the ravine concealed another danger. Vertical drop masked by soft layers. A misstep in darkness could send a person crashing on a buried ice or compacted debris. Such a fall might explain the catastrophic chest and skull injuries later documented. Trauma consistent with high-energy impact but lacking external laceration. Still, the pattern remains debated. Some specialists argue that a secondary snow collapse could have compressed those already inside the hollow. Others maintain that the injuries align more convincingly with gravitational fall than with avalanche mass. Meanwhile, the trio attempting to reach the tent face their own physiological countdown. Hypothermia progresses in stages: shivering, confusion, impaired coordination, paradoxical calm. As core temperature drops, decision-making deteriorates. Individuals may wander off course, sit down to rest, or lose the ability to stand. Their final positions suggest relentless forward effort despite failing strength. Each meter upward would have felt heavier than the last. Wind strips heat exponentially, exposed skin freezes, lungs ache with each breath, and muscles stiffen toward immobility. Eventually, the body simply refuses further command. One of the most haunting aspects of the reconstruction lies in recognizing how close they were. The tent remained less than a mile away, stocked with everything necessary for survival. Distance under normal conditions would have been trivial. Under alpine winter assault, it became insurmountable. The question of radiation, while often sensationalized, likely holds a more mundane explanation. Occupational contamination from nuclear facilities was not unheard of in that era, particularly given safety standards still evolving within the Soviet weapons program. Traces detected on clothing were elevated but not acutely dangerous. Their presence complicates the narrative, yet does not inherently imply a radiological event on the mountain itself. Reports of glowing spheres in the sky remain similarly ambiguous. Atmospheric rocket tests conducted during the late 1950s occasionally produced luminous phenomena visible across vast distances. To observers unfamiliar with such displays, silent orange lights drifting across the horizon could appear profoundly unnatural. Whether the hikers saw anything comparable is unknowable. What emerges most clearly from modern analysis is not a single dramatic cause, but a cascade of stressors: environmental threat, navigational loss, escalating cold, physical injury, and a narrowing margin between rational strategy and physiological collapse. The Dyatlov group did many things correctly. They moved together. They built fire. They shared clothing. They attempted shelter. They tried to return to supplies. None of these actions reflect hysteria. Rather, they reveal disciplined individuals confronting a rapidly deteriorating survival equation. Yet mountains operate without malice and without mercy. Small decisions compound quickly in polar conditions. A few minutes of exposure become an hour becomes irreversible heat loss. By the time rescuers arrived weeks later, the landscape had already begun its quiet work of erasure. Wind smoothed footprints. Snow softened edges. The slope resumed its indifferent stillness. Investigators would eventually close the case under the language of an undefined natural force. But the deeper lesson resisted bureaucratic phrasing. Extreme environments rarely kill through spectacle more often. They do so through convergence. Weather, terrain, timing, and human limitation intersecting in ways that leave little behind except questions. Even now, with decades of hindsight and improved scientific modeling, absolute certainty remains elusive. The mountain provided evidence enough to suggest pathways, but not enough to seal one beyond doubt. And so the final hours of the Dyatlov expedition remain suspended between reconstruction and mystery, a reminder that in the coldest places on Earth, understanding can fade as quickly as tracks in fresh snow. In the years following the closure of the investigation, the Dyatlov Pass incident did not disappear. Instead, it entered a quieter phase of existence, discussed in mountaineering circles, referenced cautiously in academic settings, and remembered privately by families who had buried their children without receiving an explanation that felt complete. Official language had attributed the deaths to a compelling natural force, yet the absence of precision created an intellectual vacuum, and vacuums rarely remain empty for long. Where certainty is limited, interpretation expands. At first, speculation remained restrained. Experienced hikers tended to favor environmental explanations, understanding from personal exposure how quickly winter landscapes can turn hostile. But as decades passed and restricted files gradually became more accessible, the narrative widened. Photographs circulated more freely, autopsy summaries were re-examined, and the peculiar combination of ordered footprints, catastrophic injuries, and incomplete causal framing encouraged alternative thinking. Among the earliest points of fascination were the reported lights in the sky. During the winter of 1959, several observers across the northern Urals described luminous spheres drifting silently overhead. These objects were typically characterized as orange or yellow, sometimes moving in formation, occasionally fading before reaching the horizon. Testimony came from hikers, meteorological personnel, and even some individuals connected to regional aviation. While such reports were logged during the original investigation, they were never elevated to central importance, largely because no direct evidentiary bridge connected the phenomena to the hikers' final movements. Later analysis suggested multiple conventional possibilities. Rocket tests conducted from distant ranges could produce high-altitude illumination visible far beyond their launch corridors. Atmospheric refraction sometimes enlarges and distorts light sources, making them appear closer or slower than they truly are. Even fragments of space debris entering the upper atmosphere can generate prolonged glow under specific conditions. Yet despite these rational pathways, the imagery of silent lights above a frozen wilderness proved difficult for the public imagination to resist. Over time, What investigators had treated as peripheral observation became, in popular retellings, a centerpiece of mystery. Another persistent theory proposed accidental exposure to secret military testing. The late 1950s were an era of accelerated weapons development, and remote territories provided natural laboratories far from population centers. Some researchers wondered whether the hikers had unknowingly entered a testing perimeter or encountered the aftermath of an aerial device. The elevated radiation readings detected on certain garments appeared, at first glance, to support this possibility. However, deeper review introduced moderation. The contamination levels were measurable but not extreme, and at least one victim had professional ties to a nuclear facility where trace exposure could plausibly transfer to clothing. No blast signatures were documented at the site. Trees showed no directional scorching. The pattern of injuries did not align cleanly with explosive shock waves, which typically produce widespread fragmentation rather than localized compression. While the military hypothesis remained intriguing, it never matured into demonstrable probability. Psychological interpretations followed a different trajectory. Some analysts explored whether a sudden internal conflict could have fractured group cohesion, suggesting that panic might spread rapidly under nocturnal stress. Yet this model struggled against behavioral evidence. The hikers built a fire, redistributed garments logically, and attempted to construct shelter, cooperative acts inconsistent with prolonged interpersonal violence. No defensive wounds indicated fighting, and no weapon traces were found. Group structure appeared to hold even as conditions deteriorated. Attention eventually returned, again and again, to environmental convergence. Researchers studying snow mechanics revisited the slope with improved modeling techniques and proposed that a delayed slab release, modest in scale, yet powerful at the tent interface, might have created both physical threat and psychological urgency. Such an event could damage the shelter enough to alarm occupants without burying them completely, explaining why the hikers evacuated quickly but were not entombed. Wind dynamics offered complementary insight. Under specific configurations, air descending from higher elevations can accelerate dramatically, producing bursts strong enough to deform structures and generate resonant frequencies across taut surfaces. Imagine lying inside a fabric enclosure while unseen forces press and vibrate against it, the darkness amplifying every sensation. Even trained individuals might interpret such stimuli as precursors to structural failure. Still, the ravine injuries resisted effortless integration into this framework. High-energy trauma demands mechanism, a fall, compression, or collision. Gradually, a blended scenario gained cautious acceptance among some specialists. Evacuation triggered by perceived avalanche risk, regrouping at the forest, followed by a secondary accident near the ravine where concealed terrain transformed a defensive shelter into a fatal trap. It was not a perfect narrative, but it required fewer extraordinary assumptions than many alternatives. As scholarly interpretations evolved, public imagination accelerated in parallel. Books, documentaries, and later digital forums transformed the Dyatlov Pass from a regional tragedy into an international puzzle. Each retelling emphasized different details: the missing tongue, the radiation, the lights, sometimes without proportional context. Mystery, once introduced, tends to magnify its own elements. Yet beneath the expanding mythology lay an unchanging core. 9 capable individuals confronted conditions that exceeded their margin for recovery. Whether the initiating trigger was shifting snow, violent wind, navigational disorientation, or some combination thereof, the outcome reflected the unforgiving arithmetic of exposure. Human physiology operates within narrow thermal limits. Once core temperature declines beyond a threshold, strength, coordination, and judgment erode with accelerating speed. Modern survival science reinforces this perspective. Decision windows in polar environments are measured not in hours, but in minutes. Remove insulated footwear, and conductive heat loss multiplies. Introduce wind, and convective cooling strips warmth faster still. Add darkness, uneven terrain, and fatigue, and the boat's resilience contracts rapidly. What appears puzzling from the safety of retrospective analysis may have felt like the least dangerous option available in that irreversible moment. Perhaps this is why the Dyatlov Pass endures not merely as a mystery, but as a study in limits. It invites reflection on the boundary where preparation yields to circumstance, where rational plans encounter variables too numerous to control. The hikers were not inexperienced thrill seekers. They were methodical, educated, and accustomed to hardship. Their story unsettles precisely because it demonstrates that competence reduces risk but never abolishes it. Over time, the mountain itself has remained indifferent to interpretation. Seasons rebuild the snowpack, winds redraw the surface, and summer briefly reveals stone before winter returns to cover it again. Travelers who cross the region today encounter no visible scar, only vastness, silence, and the subtle pressure that remote landscapes exert on human awareness. Theories will likely continue to evolve as analytical tools improve. New simulations may refine snow behavior. Future atmospheric research may clarify wind phenomena. Archival discoveries may illuminate overlooked details. Yet it is equally possible that the Dyatlov Pass will never yield a singular, universally accepted explanation. Not every historical event resolves into certainty. Some remain suspended between evidence and inference, teaching less about definitive causes and more about the complexity of real-world systems. In that sense, the silence surrounding the hiker's final night is not entirely empty. It carries a quiet instruction that nature does not negotiate, that small margins matter, and that even well-prepared journeys can intersect with forces beyond anticipation. The official investigation ended decades ago, but the intellectual journey it provoked continues, moving forward not through sensation, but through the disciplined recognition that mystery often begins where information ends. More than 6 decades have passed since the winter of 1959, yet the Dyatlov Pass incident remains one of the most studied unexplained tragedies in modern outdoor history. Time has altered the political landscape, advanced scientific understanding, and opened archives once considered permanently sealed, but the essential question, what forced 9 experienced hikers into the lethal cold, has never been answered with absolute finality. Instead, the event has settled into a rare category occupied by only a handful of historical cases. Extensively documented, rigorously analyzed, and still not fully resolved. Today, the route once traveled by Igor Dyatlov and his companions is no longer unknown territory reserved for elite Soviet expeditions. Modern hikers, equipped with satellite navigation, advanced insulation materials, real-time weather forecasting, and emergency communication devices, occasionally cross the same region. Many do so with deliberate awareness, treating the journey not merely as a physical challenge, but as a passage through a landscape permanently marked by memory. Near the area of the tragedy stand a memorial, modest, weather-beaten, and often partially buried beneath drifting snow. Visitors who reach it frequently describe an atmosphere that feels heavier than the surrounding wilderness, though nothing visible distinguishes the slope from countless others across the northern Urals. Wind still moves uninterrupted across the ridgelines. Snow still reshapes the terrain each season. The mountain has not changed its behavior to accommodate human remembrance. In the decades following the original investigation, renewed official reviews attempted to bring greater technical clarity. Modern forensic methods allowed experts to reinterpret injury patterns with improved biomechanical models. Snow scientists reconstructed slope dynamics using computer simulations unavailable to mid-20th century investigators. Atmospheric researchers revisited wind data to evaluate whether sudden pressure events could plausibly have contributed to the hikers' decision to abandon their tent. One widely discussed reassessment concluded that a form of slab avalanche remained the most consistent natural explanation when all physical variables were considered together. According to this model, Wind-driven snow could have gradually accumulated above the tent before releasing in a compact mass strong enough to damage structural support and convince the occupants that a larger slide might follow. Even a partial collapse would justify rapid evacuation, particularly at night when visual confirmation was impossible. Yet the same reassessment acknowledged complexity. Terrain irregularities, delayed fracture mechanics, and the hikers' subsequent movements toward the forest suggested that no single factor operated in isolation. Environmental crises often unfold as chains rather than singular blows, a destabilized slope followed by disorientation, then exposure, then injury. For many specialists, this layered interpretation has shifted the conversation from mystery versus explanation toward a more nuanced understanding of risk convergence. The Dyatlov Pass may represent not an unsolvable riddle, but a rare intersection where multiple survivable problems aligned in the worst possible sequence. Still, consensus does not erase contemplation. Part of what sustains attention around the incident is not merely uncertainty about cause, but recognition of how narrow the margin between survival and catastrophe can be in extreme environments. Modern gear improves odds, it does not eliminate vulnerability. Psychological research conducted over the past several decades has also deepened appreciation for the cognitive effects of cold stress. As core temperature falls, the brain prioritizes immediate relief over long-term strategy. Judgment compresses toward the present moment. Actions later perceived as irrational often emerge from internally coherent logic shaped by urgency. In this light, the hiker's behavior, swift exit, regrouping, attempts at fire and shelter, reflects adaptive response under perceived threat rather than confusion. Another dimension of the legacy lies in how the tragedy reshaped expedition culture. Greater emphasis is now placed on slope evaluation, nighttime hazard awareness, layered sleeping protocols, and redundant navigation methods. Training programs frequently cite historical incidents, including Dyatlov, not as cautionary folklore, but as analytical case studies illustrating how experienced teams can still encounter irreversible escalation. For the families of those who died, however, the passage of time has never transformed the event into abstraction. Behind every forensic diagram and meteorological chart stands a life interrupted, futures that never unfolded, careers never completed, relationships never formed. Memorial gatherings continue quietly, honoring not only the mystery, but the individuals themselves. Students, engineers, friends, sons, and daughters who set out together with ordinary expectations of return. Standing on that mountainside today, one is struck less by drama than by scale. The horizon stretches with austere clarity. Sound carries differently in such spaces, softened by snow, yet sharpened by distance. It becomes easier to understand how small a human presence truly is against geological time and atmospheric force. Mountains do not remember in the way people do. They record nothing intentionally. Storm follows storm, thaw yields to freeze, decades pass without annotation. What endures instead is human narrative, the effort to interpret, to learn, and perhaps to reduce the likelihood of repetition. The Dyatlov Pass incident ultimately resists a single emotional register. It is at once a historical case, a scientific puzzle, a lesson in environmental humility, and a story about the limits of preparation. The hikers were not reckless. They were skilled, organized, and accustomed to hardship. Their story unsettles precisely because it demonstrates that competence does not grant immunity from nature's larger equations. And yet, there's a quiet form of resolution embedded within that recognition. Understanding risk does not require eliminating every unknown. It requires acknowledging that uncertainty itself is a permanent feature of exploration. Progress lies in narrowing margins, improving response, and remembering that even the best plans exist within systems too vast for complete control. As long as people continue to move toward remote horizons, drawn by curiosity, challenge, and the enduring human desire to step beyond mapped certainty, stories like Dyatlov will retain relevance. not as warnings against adventure, but as reminders of the respect such landscapes demand. The official investigation closed with restrained language, attributing the tragedy to a powerful natural force. Decades of research have refined that phrase without entirely replacing it. Perhaps this is where the narrative now rests, not in perfect explanation, but in informed understanding. The mountain remains. The wind still crosses the pass. And somewhere beneath each winter's new snow lies the silent intersection of human ambition and the vast, indifferent mechanics of the natural world.